Hi, I'm Nia Shanks of Lift Like a Girl, and I'm going to teach you how to squat. More specifically, I'm going to teach you how to perform a squat with a barbell on your back. Now, we're going to go over several important things as far as foot placement, the position of the bar on your back, and some other things. But before we actually get to the point where we have a bar on our back, I want to address some of the really important cues you need to know before you get to that point. So the first thing you want to keep in mind when squatting is establishing the stance that is most comfortable for you. Now, I like to tell people to start from a very generic point and then tweak from there as you need. So the position I tell people to start with is set your heels to where they're about shoulder width apart, and then from there point your toes out slightly, anywhere from about a 15 to 30 degree angle out. Some people are going to find it more comfortable to have a slighter angle. Some people will find they want a little more aggressive angle with their toes pointing out. So that's where I recommend you start. Heels, shoulder width apart, toes pointed out slightly. And then as you play with this movement and see what's more comfortable, you may find that you feel better having your feet a little closer, or you may find that your hips and everything feel better with your feet a little wider and toes out a little more. So just play with it a little bit and see what feels best to your hips and as far as getting the correct range of motion. So once you get your feet set about shoulder width apart, toes pointed out slightly. The other important cue you want to keep in mind when you squat is that you always want your knees to track in line with your feet and your toes. So when you squat down, keep an eye on my knees. You'll see how they stay in line with my feet and toes at all times. This is really important when you squat because some people, when they squat down, they do this, to where their knees are caving in and coming inside their feet. That's a very common mistake you want to make sure you don't make. So, whenever you squat, knees track in line with the toes when you squat down and when you squat up. The other important thing you want to keep in mind when squatting, you want to make sure that your back stays tight and rigid. And what I mean by that is what we're going to do when the bar is on our back, you're going to push your chest out just a bit to get your back in a nice neutral, tight position. And from there, you're going to just lock your back into place. And so what that does is it means when you squat, your back is not going to move. You want to keep it tight and rigid the entire time. Because a common mistake some people make is they overarch to where they hyperextend their back. And so when they're squatting, it's this really hyperextended position. You don't want to do that. You want to get your back neutral, and then you want to hold it tight. You want to keep it in that rigid position. And I tell people to think of their back when they're squatting kind of as a crowbar, just really tight. So the other thing, this is really important too because it's confusing to some people. Not everyone's squat, barbell back squat, is going to look the same. So, everybody's going to essentially follow a few basic cues, like keeping your back nice and rigid, knees tracking in line with your toes. Those are important things, as well as hitting the proper squat depth, which we'll get to in a moment. But, for example, I have long legs and a short torso. So when I perform a barbell back squat, my torso naturally is going to be leaned forward a bit more. That's because my femurs are so long, it just naturally pushes me into this position. Now contrast that with somebody who has the opposite body type as me, somebody who has short legs but a long torso. When they squat and apply these same cues, their torso is going to be more upright. Everybody's anthropometry is different, so don't get panicky if you see you're a bit more upright than me. It could be because we have different limb lengths. So that's just really important to keep in mind. So now what we're going to do, we're going to apply those same cues, getting your feet placed, keeping your back nice and rigid, and we're going to get the bar on our back. Now the other thing I really want to tell you that's important, if you train alone or if you're learning this movement for the first time and you're a little nervous or apprehensive about it, do yourself a favor and squat inside of a power rack like I have set up here. And what you want to do is set the safety bars a couple inches below where you'll be at your lowest position of the squat. So for example, when I squat, I generally come down to about this position. So the bar will be about right here. You want the safety bars just a couple inches lower than that. You want them low enough so the bar doesn't hit them when you squat down because that's annoying. But you also don't want them so low that it doesn't really help you out. The advantage of squatting in a rack with safety bars is just in case if you go down and you can't get back up, you just have to drop down a couple inches and those safety bars will catch the barbell. That's a great way to give you a bit more confidence if you're learning this movement. So take advantage of that. Squat inside a power rack for extra safety. It's always a great idea. I will not be squatting in the rack for this video because I don't want that to get in the way of the view of what I'm doing. So what we're going to do now is establish bar placement. Now first you want to have the bar, I tell people kind of about upper chest level. You want the bar high enough to where you don't have to get real low and squat it out of the rack, but you also don't want it so high that to get it out of the rack you have to get on your tiptoes. So about collarbone level is a good place to start. The other thing that I want to take before I actually take this out and squat it is where the bar sits on your back. Now I like to have the bar resting on my traps, and you want to make sure that that very prominent bone at the base of your neck, that's the spinous process of your C7 vertebrae. You can easily feel it. You don't want the bar resting there because it would hurt. I tell people to have the bar a little below that. You want the bar resting on your traps, all of this muscle. That way it's much more comfortable. So how I'm going to set up is I'm going to put my hands on the bar a little wider than shoulder width apart. Ideally you want to have your hands as close together as you can come. I mean, you don't want them in here, that would be absurd. But you want your hands as close as you can get them, as close to shoulder width apart as you can. The reason for that is it helps keep your back nice and tight. So, and keep in mind this kind of varies too, again, depending on limb lengths. Everybody is different. If you have really long forearms, you're going to need your grip to be a little wider to be comfortable. Some people can get really close. Just get your hands as close as you comfortably can on the bar to create that nice shelf of muscle for the bar to rest on. The other thing here, and this is very individual, I prefer when my hand is on the bar, my thumb is laying over the top of the bar with my fingers. This is more comfortable for my elbows. Now some people prefer the security and the feel of having their thumb around the bar. Either one is fine, do what's most comfortable for you, but my elbows and my shoulders feel much better when I have my thumb over the bar. So my hands are a little wider than shoulder width apart. I'm going to get under the bar. It is resting on my traps. It is below the C7 spinous process, so I don't have a bar resting on bone because that would be uncomfortable. And then hopefully you can see that my upper back is nice and tight. I have my shoulder blades pulled together. And so from here, what you want to do is just stand up with the bar. And this is where people tend to mess up. They don't know how to get out of the rack. They take too many steps. Do yourself a favor and be really efficient and just take one step back, take the other one back, and then get your feet set. Now remember, my heels are about shoulder width apart. My toes are pointed out about 15, 30 degrees. And then from here, what we want to do, you're going to stick your chest out just a little bit to get your back nice and tight. Remember what we said earlier about getting your back tight, and you're going to keep it locked into this tight, rigid position. And I'm just going to demonstrate a few reps before I go over the movement. So my back is nice and tight. I'm going to stick my butt back and bend my knees at the same time to lower down. Back stays tight, and then come back up. Pay attention to the depth. You want your hips to go a little lower than your knees, a little more if you can without your back moving, but at least to the point where your hips are just a little below your kneecaps, and then come back up. Notice that as I stick my butt back, my knees bend at the same time. And yes, my knees come forward over my toes just a little. That is perfectly fine because my knees are planted, my feet are planted firmly on the ground, and everything is nice and tight. And plus, again, this is where some individual differences will come into play depending on your limb length. So again, squatting down, coming back up. Pay attention to how my back stays nice and tight. It's not hyperextended. It's not moving around. I squat down until my hips are a little lower than my knees, and then I come back up. And also notice that as I come up, my hips and shoulders rise at the same time. You don't want your butt to shoot up before your shoulders. And then when you're done, walk it into the rack. Now let's go over a couple important things when doing that movement, some stuff that maybe you weren't able to see. When I was squatting down, as we discussed at the beginning of this video, that my knees are tracking in line with my toes on the way down and on the way up. The other really important thing that you probably weren't able to see is the position of the barbell. When you squat, the barbell travels in a vertical line over your midfoot. And this is a really good way to make sure you're doing the movement correctly, because if the bar gets too far in front of you, then your heels may come up, and that's a good way to hurt your knees and just to fall over. I'll show that to you one more time so you can see the importance of that. So again, to set up for the squat, hands a little wider than shoulder width apart. Come under the bar, get in the center of it, the bar resting on your traps below your C7 spinous process. Stand up, take a step back to be efficient. My feet about shoulder width apart, toes pointed out slightly. Pay attention to the path of the barbell. It's going to travel in a vertical line over my midfoot at all times. I'm sticking my butt back and then also bending my knees to lower down. That bar is traveling in a nice vertical path. My back is nice and rigid, it doesn't move. And then rack the bar. So again, feel free to play a little bit with your stance. You may want to be a little closer, you may want to be a little wider, you may prefer to have your toes 15 degrees, you may prefer to have them pointed out at 30. It's okay to take your time to play around with this to see what feels best. You just want to make sure that you apply those really important cues. Make sure your knees always travel in line with your toes. Make sure your back is nice and rigid. Make sure that your hips go just a little below your kneecaps so you hit that proper range of motion. And that's basically it for the barbell back squat. Oh, one other important tip. If you're not sure if you're doing this correctly and you don't have access to a great coach, get a camera, record your sets. This way you can see what's going on. You can see if you're actually applying these cues and if you're hitting the proper depth or what you need to work on. And if you do that, get a video about the angle I'm using here, a little bit from behind. This is a really good angle to see how your back is doing and also your squat depth. And if you're not sure if your knees are tracking in line with your toes, also get a video from the front. This way you can actually see what's happening and then you can make any corrections you need to. So at that point, watch the video again, see what you have to do. Maybe you found out your back isn't staying tight because your hands are too far apart. There's all these little things you can tweak to improve your form and to really hone in your technique with this movement. So that is how you perform a barbell back squat.